Narayana Samarambam Vyasa Shankara Madhyamam Asmadacharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam. Om Vasudevendra Yogindram Natva Jnana Pradam Gurum Mumukshunam Hitartaya Tattva Bodha-Intro. Okay, in the last video, we did a review. One thing I learned from that is that I'm not going to try to review 11 lessons in one video ever again. So, because it's important to not only go over, not to just review the information, but to go over it again and again. Repetition is really important in Vedanta. And also, these lessons can kind of stretch out over long periods of time. So it's good to remember, where we started and kind of the trajectory that we're headed in. So I'll try to do a review video probably, maybe every 3 to 5 videos or something like that. So at this point, we've gone all the way up until the introductory prayer of Tattva Bodha. We've discussed that at length. And now it's time to move on in the text. If you saw the last post on my website, you'll see that I just published my newly revised commentary on this text. So you can refer to that to follow along here with these verses. So the prayer is, the teacher dispels the darkness of self-ignorance with the light of self-knowledge. Salutations to the self in that form. So we say a little prayer there in order that we may successfully study this text. We say that the teacher dispels the darkness of self-ignorance, because that is the problem here. We just don't quite know what our true nature is. You could say that we don't know we don't know who we are. The teacher here, I've translated that as teacher. The word is guru. Gu means darkness, and ru translates to annulment or removal. So the teacher is the darkness removing light. Darkness is a common symbol of ignorance, and light is a common symbol of knowledge. This teaching shines the light on your self-ignorance. Okay? It's not going to help you to be less ignorant about cellular biology or quantum mechanics or anything like that, but it's going to remove ignorance about who you are. So once you move past the prayer of this text, it states the purpose, which is good. You're probably not going to read a text, a scripture, without knowing what its purpose is. So Vedanta, being the pragmatic means of knowledge that it is, it says right up front what the purpose is. So, Tattva Bodha, the knowledge of truth, is presented here for those seeking freedom, or moksha. And if I haven't said that before, the word moksha means freedom. It could also be translated as enlightenment. Right? But that word has many shades of meaning, so we're just going to say freedom here, or moksha. All right, moksha is one that you might want to remember, because I will probably use that fairly often. So what's the text for? Well, it's for helping you get moksha, helping you get freedom. And what we've said is that freedom is your true nature. It's what you are. You are non-dual, limitless consciousness. We've talked about that quite a bit. Your true nature is non-dual consciousness, the indivisible, independently existent, unchanging, eternal, infinite, imperceptible essence of everything. Now, you have no limits. Right? So you're always free. It may not seem that way, but that's what we're going to use this teaching for, to help you see that in fact you are actually already free. You're trying to get freedom from the pursuit of objects. We've talked about that before. We try to get particular things, we try to get rid of particular things, because when we do, it seems to make us feel happy. But when we investigate the fact that the same object can make one person happy and one person unhappy, it can make the same person feel happy originally and then not happy later, or even the same object can give you different degrees of happiness. Like the first piece of chocolate cake is very good, the 15th piece is very bad. So it goes from making you happy to making you unhappy. Knowing these things, seeing these things, doing this analysis, we have to honestly say, well, the happiness is not coming from the object. And what is happiness anyway? Happiness is the appreciation of your freedom, of your limitless nature. And when you get what you want, there's no division there. There's no division between you and what you want. And that uncomfortable desire resolves. So essentially the mind becomes peaceful, and in that moment it can accurately reflect what your true nature is. That translates to a feeling of happiness. We're trying to get that feeling of happiness out of objects, out of circumstances, but really that feeling of happiness only comes from an appreciation of what we really are. So we're trying to find here and make it clear what we really are, so we don't have to depend on those objects. And that's freedom. That's the purpose of this text. Now, it's obvious that we all want freedom because that's what we're trying to do in all of our activities. So, Tattva Bodha then says, not just what the text is for, but how it aims to accomplish that. The direct means of attaining freedom is the discrimination between the self, Atma, and the not self, Anatma. We've already said that Atma means the self, and I won't go into that lengthy definition again because I'm sure you all have all memorized it by now. But we're using this other Sanskrit term, Anatma, not self. Right? So we have Atma. When you put the un at the beginning of it, it negates it. So we have Atma self and Anatma not self. And what is not self? Not self is objects. Anything you can know, anything you can experience. Any aspect of the external world, any aspect of your own body, any aspect of the internal world of your mind. So feelings, thoughts, emotions, memories, dreams. The mind itself is an object. All of that is not self. So we're saying that the direct means of attaining freedom is discriminating between the two. A common use of discrimination is mistreating somebody based on their religion or their gender or their race. We hear a lot about that in the news. That isn't what we're talking about here. The word discrimination is viveka in Sanskrit. That's not one that you really need to memorize, but I'm saying it here. Viveka means to make a distinction between two different things. Right? So we're not mistreating one thing and treating another one better based on a particular quality or attribute. we're making a distinction between two things. We're making a distinction between the self, what we are, and the not self, objects. Why is that the means for attaining freedom? Attain isn't really the right word because attain makes it sound like an accomplishment. If someone came in all excited and said to you, "Hey, I attained something, I did something," and you say, "Well, what is it?" And you said, "I became myself." You wouldn't exactly need to pat them on the back for that. Why? Because they already are themselves. Okay? It's not an achievement or an attainment. We just use that word lightly. All that it means is saying, you come to the understanding that you are already free. Now, we're saying that the discrimination between these two is what constitutes freedom. We said that discrimination is distinguishing between two different things. Now, why does not distinguishing cause bondage, and why does that equal freedom? Because without distinguishing between the two, we get the two things mixed up, and that causes a problem. Right? When you're actually limitless, when you're actually non-dual, when you're infinite and eternal, you take yourself to be these objects that are not infinite, that are not eternal, because it appears that we are, an object, namely the body and the mind. And so we have accidentally superimposed selfness, if you will, onto the body and the mind. And that becomes a problem because the body and mind have all kinds of problems. So if what you are is really free, then what's necessary then is to make a distinction clearly between what you are and what you aren't. We're saying that the body and mind are anatma, not self. So that's what the text is about, and that's the means of attaining freedom, because by disidentifying, by distinguishing yourself from the objects, then you enjoy the freedom that you already are. You only think that you only suffer, you only think that you aren't free because you have yourself mixed up with something that suffers, with something that is not free. As we've said before, it's a non-dual reality. So the idea initially when we say, well, there's only the self, but then we say, well, there's the self and there's the not self. Now, how can that be? We talked about this a little bit before. I'll go back to the example of our ring here because this is a very important issue. You don't want to get hung up on this. We say it's non-dual reality, and then we start talking about the self and the not self. So that can be perplexing at first. But as a reminder, what we've said here is that non-duality or oneness, that everything is one thing, consciousness, does not mean sameness. As we've talked about before, we can say that this circular shape is nothing but silver, right? You can't demonstrate a circular shape without the silver. It's inseparable. But we wouldn't say that the silver is the circular shape. And the name that we give to that circular shape, ring, that has no substance at all. It's just a title for this particular form. So we've got name and form. All right, ring is name and form. We can say that the name and form is always the silver that it depends on, but the silver is never the name and form, because you can change, you can take the name away, you can change the form, you can take the form away, and silver is always there. And besides, when you say there's a ring there, you can't actually demonstrate a ring in and of itself, because when you look into it, when you investigate it, all you see is the silver. So in that regard, we're saying that objects, or not self, is just name and form. It's an appearance, and you can definitely say that you experience them like you experience this ring. I mean, it's undeniable to say that, you know, you are experiencing this ring, but when you try to demonstrate ring, you find out that all you're really experiencing is silver. And there's not ring experience there. There's not a thing called ring. There's not a substance called ring. So what we're saying is that although it's a non-dual reality, there is the self, and then there's the name and form, the not self. We can say that the not self is the self, as the name and form is actually the silver, but we would never say that the self is the not self. There's no actual not self, because the name and form has no substance. So it's still a non-dual reality, but because of the name and form, because of the objects appear, we take them to be real. We take them to be substantial, and we identify with them. We say, oh, this body is real, this mind is real, and not only that, I am the body. So when I think I'm the body, I have problems. And if the body and mind is real, then they're real problems. There's a mix-up. I am superimposing my selfness onto something that I am not. Okay? If I'm the self, I can't be the objects. If you are silver, you can't really be the ring. Right? The ring form and the name can be you, but you are not the name and form. So when we have this mix-up, we have self and not self being mixed together, we have to have discrimination to sort out the two. And thus, suffering stops. You know, freedom, which is already your nature, is seen to be true. It's appreciated by you. That's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about a particular experience, a specific experience. And we've discussed this before, but it's also a crucial issue. It's not as if we're saying that, you know, at some point in time you'll have an amazing meditative experience or some kind of epiphany. A lot of us tend to try to chase these kind of things initially because they're interesting, they feel good. You know, it's not as if they don't happen, but does that equal freedom? Well, no, it doesn't, because any experience is temporary. You know, it starts and then it ends. You know, so you have a particular experience and it's amazing and mind-blowing, but then eventually it ends and you're stuck back with what? You're stuck back with the misunderstanding that you're the body and mind. And you say, whoa, I'm the mind that had this experience. But that can't be true. You know, mind is not self. Mind is known to you. So what is really needed is the knowledge, the understanding that it's not you. Okay, you're not actually the experience itself. You're not the one experiencing. Now, does that mean that you somehow take the knowledge, you know, the objects and like physically separate them from the self? No. You know, can I try to pull form or name off of this silver? No. It's a non-dual reality. They're not. You can't be separated physically. What we're going for here is knowledge. Okay, knowledge that it's an understanding that the self is not actually affected by these objects that appear in it. You are not actually affected by the names and forms that appear in you, by the body and by the mind. Understanding that firmly and clearly is freedom, because it's an appreciation of the way things actually are. It's not as if when you know who you are, that suddenly the world disappears. How could that possibly be? We look to the sages of the past. We look to some of these great people and we listen to their teachings or read their writings. I mean, how could they have possibly taught or spoke or wrote anything if there was no world for them? If they didn't see a world, it doesn't make any sense. What we're saying here is that freedom is just knowledge. It's just understanding the way things really are, that you actually are the ever-free self. And for that, discrimination is required. You got to sort the two out mentally, not physically. We're not going to take objects and move them over there and then you're over here. No, you're always unaffected by the objects. You just have to understand how that is so. It's said here that the direct means of attaining freedom is discrimination between the self and the not self. It doesn't say anything else. It doesn't list any other particular practices. It doesn't list any specific experience. Understand that. This is really important here. Experience is fine. There's no problem with experience whatsoever. And spiritual practice, different forms of yoga, meditation, prayer, chanting, singing, worship, all of those kind of things definitely have their place. I actually can't encourage them enough. They're very helpful. They're very purifying for the mind. They lead to a better life, happiness in general, albeit temporary happiness, but they do, because it does. It cleans up your mind. They play an important role in preparing one for the undertaking of Vedanta. And actually, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more somewhere in the next section coming up, because it is important. We say things like, we're talking about knowledge here, not exactly experience, not a particular action. It makes it seem like experience is completely invalid and that action, we just throw that out the window. That isn't the case. They have their place, they have their role, but it needs to be understood that no particular action and no particular experience causes or equals moksha. Not a particular action doesn't cause moksha, because moksha is just the appreciation of what your nature is. Okay, so no action makes you what you already are. You just need to understand what you already are. So since discrimination is the only way to go, all right, we make that very clear, that discriminating between what you are and what you are not is the means to freedom, is the means to enlightenment. And it's just a matter of understanding. I apologize if I'm repeating myself here, but this is very, very important. If you can't get past this idea, if you can't see this fact clearly, then the rest of the studying the rest of Vedanta is exceptionally difficult. So discrimination is important, and thankfully the next line of the text says, the method of discrimination, which will be unfolded in this text, and that's good, because if discrimination is the way to go, we need to know how to do it. The method of discrimination which will be unfolded in this text is for those endowed with the fourfold qualifications. This is also potentially an unpopular idea. It's sort of unpopular that freedom isn't an experience, a particular experience, or that it's not caused by action. That's not always a popular idea, because it runs contrary to a lot of things that we believe. The qualifications issue is also a bit unpopular or problematic for some people, but let's just try to put it into a practical example. I'll try to wrap this up here because running a little low on time. It's not as if you would walk into a university, sit down in a PhD level class about physics, and expect to learn anything. You wouldn't make that assumption. You wouldn't presume to do that. Why wouldn't you do that? Because you know that you didn't get, without doing any kind of preparation, if you're going to go for your PhD, I mean, did you get your master's in physics? Well, no. Did you get your bachelor's? Did you get your associate's degree? Maybe you didn't even hardly take physics in high school. Right? So the reason you wouldn't go into that class is because you realize that you aren't properly qualified to undertake that subject. It's pretty obvious. I'm not going to go to college if I haven't graduated high school. I'm not going to go on to become a PhD if I haven't done my undergraduate studies. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. And you can put it in any context. It's not as if you're going to try to walk into a professional basketball game or a professional football game and start playing without doing any kind of preparation or training. Because every field that you go into requires certain amounts of qualifications. Why would Vedanta be any different? It isn't. Sometimes people think, being the independent people that we are, kind of do-it-yourself spirit, and that's completely understandable. I don't remember if you remember that movie Good Will Hunting. You have Matt Damon, and he's a genius. He's extremely intelligent. So especially intelligent people think that maybe they can just go ahead and just pop right into Vedanta, because their intelligence will compensate for what they don't know. Like in Good Will Hunting, Matt Damon doesn't go to school. He works at a university, but he's never actually gone to school. He's such an intelligent guy that he can just go to the library, read some books, and be as smart as any of the people who have done advanced studies at the university. Vedanta isn't like that. Right? We're not talking about just intelligence level. We're not talking about memorizing facts and figures. It's true. Maybe you could walk into a PhD level class at a university if you were exceptionally intelligent and you went and just did a lot of independent research. But with Vedanta, it's not like that. It's not just memorizing facts and figures. We're talking about the most subtle topic possible, and that's your own true nature. There's many exceptionally intelligent people in this world, much more intelligent than you or I or you and me even combined, that have absolutely no idea who they are. There's just too many wrong notions that we have about ourselves, and it blocks the appreciation of who we are. And when we come to the teaching, as I've said before, those wrong notions interpret and distort what the teaching is saying, and we tend to misinterpret them, misunderstand what they're saying. But let's say that's not the whole picture. Because also with Vedanta, it requires a lot of dedication, and it requires an exceptionally clear mind. It does require you to think a lot, and not only think a lot, but to think a lot in a consistent basis. Be able to reflect on the teachings again and again and again. And that just can't happen in a mind that is disturbed. If there's a mind that's very anxious, full of fears, full of desires, full of anger or negative emotions, then every time you try to direct your attention at the subject, right, every time that you're trying to contemplate on the matter at hand, on these teachings of Vedanta, then your mind starts to get scattered. You can't concentrate. You can't keep your attention focused for long enough. So when we talk about qualifications, which we'll have to take up specifically in the next video, what we mean by qualifications is not that you've studied a particular amount of texts, that you've gone to school or anything like that. What we're talking about are mental qualities. And everybody does have these mental qualities to a degree. But in order to successfully study Vedanta, then you need to further develop these. They need to be highly developed mental qualities. And so that's what we're saying. It's not we're not trying to exclude anyone here, but no one, if you walked into the PhD physics class and they told you that you were not prepared and that you would have to leave, it's not exclusion. It's just a statement of fact. It's like the proper base or foundation has not been laid, so you can't exactly expect to build a house on top of a lot or a piece of land that doesn't have a foundation. So these things are foundational qualities of mind, ones that you can actually continue to cultivate as you study the teaching. And having them makes it easier and faster to understand what's being said. And since we're out of time here, we'll actually leave the specific qualifications for the next video. I hope to see you then. Purnamidam Purnamidam Purnat Purnamadachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.
Bhaja Govindam Bhaja Govindam.